Thank you, everyone. Welcome in. My name is Macarena Gómez-Barris. I'm the director of the Center for Environmental Humanities, and I'm excited to welcome you into this two-day symposium. And this is the first moment of our symposium on extractive zones in the digital age. And I just want to welcome in Daniel Selwyn, who is co-host of the London Mining Network and will give a presentation towards the end of our time. I want to say thank you to many people. There'll be people on the slide behind me. We'll have to Amanda, Benjamin, Isaac, Damien, Rachel, Gregory, Matthew, Modern Culture, Lauren, Madison, and others, and the CEHAB governing board for this event. It's been a joy to work with the CoGood Institute. People have helped me actualize this hybrid and interconnected vision. The effort that we're up to today is really to create an anti-colonial and an anti-extractivist network across 2 days of this conference and symposium. So thank you, CoGood and CEHAB and all the great people there. You know who you are. And I want to thank you to the audience also out in the ethers for joining us, that include a group of graduate students who are taking a course on approaches to the environmental humanities. It's a course I co-teach currently with Professor Rebecca Schneider at Brown University. And if you'd like to find out more about the program, the CEHAB website online has much of the information. The CoGood Institute website has that information. You can look for that in the chat. And please follow us on social media, even though, of course, these platforms are also extractive. That's a place where we're using to kind of create this submerged network. You'll find more information about the program tonight, and most of the program will be hybrid and available to you. So for this particular panel this afternoon, tonight, or this morning, I guess depending on where you're situated in time and space, we've invited an amazing group. I can't say enough of this leading edge group of thinkers, of makers, of organizers, of artists and activists into the conversation to share their research. They'll extend our understanding of extractive zones, a term I use to name the regional, planetary, and interconnected spaces of capitalism in the drive to convert ever more indigenous and African, Asian, Latin American spaces into resource. So the extractive zone is really this term that names the thingification of life and the ongoing colonial waging of war against the earth and its racialized peoples. I'd like to say, and I think this is really important, that the spaces of racial capitalist exploitation are not a hyper object, but live on in specific territories and in bodies that continue to power the technosphere. And this is, for instance, the copper geographies of the Andes, which hopefully you can see at some point, that the photographer Ignacio Acosta has richly documented in this image. This is a particular space in the Atacama Desert, but like Peru, China, Congo, Australia, there are many other copper geographies of the world. And you can see in this image, right, the extractions, the incisions, the scars that are continuously made upon the land. In what Eduardo Galeano famously called the open veins of Latin America, but what we may now call the open veins of planet Earth. So since I first published The Extractive Zone in 2017, it's no exaggeration to say that there's been a 300% increase in extracted material, much of which, as we'll hear about today, goes to power new energy economies, new energy infrastructures. We know this, we're in the middle of this acute intensification right now, but also the extraction of rare earth minerals to power the digital economy. The extractive zone is now a planetary condition, but it continues to invisibilize and disrupt the relations between the human and more than human world. Or as Marx first put it, it creates a nearly impossible kind of regime That is the metabolic rift, that kind of open wound, the metabolic rift between the human and natura. Last year, next slide, please, I had the opportunity to visit Panera, a small but vital cultural hub that was exhibiting the work of Ignacio Acosta that we just saw. And there in that space, I was asked everyone, has anyone ever been to the Atacama Desert? And all of the audience members said no. And so I asked them to raise their cell phones and suggested that even if they hadn't been there, they carried the Atacama in their cell phones. So this is what we'll be doing, thinking about the kind of territories of extraction alongside embodied formats. And in this very simple exercise and performative moment, we literally materialized these alienated relations of extraction within the global capitalist economy in this embodied collective way. It's easy to buy in, right, into the seductive fantasy that the world has become altogether dematerialized. And I want to say that we're thinking about consumptive practices, vernacular practices across the global Southeast and Indigenous North, in conditions that are highly industrialized and difficult toxic conditions, and that all congeal into, as this image shows, what McKinsey work has termed the mineral sandwich in our own pocket. This is also what one of our presenters, John Beller, has called the blood in our computers to really note the alienated process and condition of labor and tech commodities. So tonight or today or this morning, our work will really be to map and countermap these extractive zones and to discuss how these are also spaces of really deep refusal. And in this moment of ongoing genocide and terroricide against Gaza, the intensification of war against Lebanon and Iran and other spaces around the world, my heart really knows, my thinking heart knows that we must work together to continue to think about decolonial research, epistemologies, praxis, possibility, action, and hopefully not be illegible, right? Be illegible, but also not illegible against the colonial frame. So the point is really to find these alternative ways of knowing and feeling, ways of being that unsettle these colonial relationships and the forms of violence against land, against peoples that they produce. So with that said, I'm really excited for tonight, and I'm going to hand it off to our first presenter. All of the bios can be found online, and after the presentations, we look forward to your comments, your questions, your engagement in the chat space to really create this network with us all. So I'm handing it to Martín Arboleda, followed by John Beller, followed by Misha Cárdenas, followed by Alex Moulton and Inge Salo, Linda Schilling, Nicolás Díaz Bejarano, and Daniel Selwyn, my co-host, will conclude us before we open up. So thank you everyone again for being here. Martín, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Macarena, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm not seeing my slides. Should I like share my screen or? Okay, okay, yeah, I see. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Macarena. Thank you very much for the Center of Environmental Humanities. I'm really excited to be here. Really happy to see also Daniel Selwyn and the London Mining Network, an organization that has been very inspiring and that I really, and whose work I really admire. So I will time myself to be precise with the time. So could I, the first slide? Yeah, thank you. So I think we have been all struck by awe seeing the images of the Artemis, the beautiful images of the blue marble planet Earth, right? And I'm thinking that, like as Chakravarti says, that we are not seeing here the globe, we are seeing the planet, right? And to encounter the planet, according to Chakravarti, is to encounter something that is a condition of human existence and yet profoundly indifferent to that existence. So the question of the planet places like at the forefront the question not just of sustainability as a question of social and relations, but of habitability habitability understood as that which makes a planet friendly to host the continuous existence of life, of complex multicellular life, as is the human life. So, thinking about the question of of habitability, I want to go back in time to 1910, the Mexican Revolution, and the slogan, as we all know, the popular group led by Emiliano Zapata, the popular movement, which challenged oligarchic power and U.S. imperialism under the slogan "Land and Freedom." I think that the Mexican Revolution, it is important to think that it inspires us or compels us to think about the variation of the slogan today as earth and freedom. So if you want to move to the next slide, please. So the Mexican Revolution gave rise to the Querétaro Constitution in 1917 in Mexico, which declared and enshrined the sovereign ownership by the Mexican nation, not the state, over the land, the resources, and the waters. This was a constitutional amendment that led to the subsequent nationalization of oil in 1938 under the Lázaro Cárdenas government. I'm going back to this story precisely to say that anti-extractivism, resistance, and refusal are fundamental and are relevant, but they are not enough. We think beyond resistance and refusal and anti-extractivism, and it is imperative to think about the conditions of possibility for collective control and governance of the life support systems that make our life possible. And for that reason, we need to go back to the archive of nationalizations, with, of course, the nationalization of oil in Mexico being, like a fundamental starting point. This, was, like the nationalization of Mexico was hinted at by Andrés Manuel López Obrador during the 2022 nationalization of lithium in Mexico, referring specifically to, like that kind of, like forward vision and heroic act of the Cardenismo at that moment. Could you move on to the next slide, please? And I think, can I switch to the next slide or? Yeah, thank you. And again, please, because it's two images. Yeah. So after in the no, before in the 1960s, many processes of nationalization. Could you please go back to the previous one? During the 1960s, nationalizations took place across third world, especially in the context of struggles for national liberation and socialism. So we have a poster of the OSPAL, Organization of Solidarity with African, Asian, and Americans, and also a poster for the nationalization of copper in Chile. So it was also reflected efforts by the organized working class to a certain control over their own national resources against the encroaching power of imperialism. And in the next slide, please. So I want to go back to a fundamental book that was published in 2023 in Spanish. It needs to be, I think it needs to be urgently translated into English. It was originally published in French, written by Marcel Mauss in 1920 after the Great War. And in this book, he discussed the relation between nationalization and socialism. He was, of course, like shocked by the chauvinistic forms of nationalism, and he thought about the conditions for enduring peace and solidarity between nations. And he argued that nationalization was the condition for solidarity between nations. He argued the conditions for enduring peace and solidarity between nations rest on the capacity to strongly own their economic destinies, being able to provide mutual benefits to each other over and against private interests. So for Marcel Mauss, nationalization was the condition for the kind of reciprocity and gift economies that he had theorized in The Gift, right? Can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so just to think about what would entail thinking about nationalization of natural resources today, there's literature. Theory of Francos has written important works on what is called resource nationalism 2.0, right? Saying that like some forms of nationalizations have returned, especially connected with the energy transition. And we need to keep track of these scholarly literature and political events, right? But however, I think that we are yet to discuss the relation of nationalization and habitability, the conditions of life, because at some point it will be inevitable that the global community, the global working class, will need to exert sovereign control over natural resources against fossil capital. And I want to like start wrapping up my talk with this beautiful mural by Diego Rivera, painted in 1928, I think, which represents, you know, like the Querétaro Constitution in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, and says, "True civilization will be harmony of man, of peoples, and the earth, and peoples between them." Right. So I think if we translate land, tierra, it can be translated as land or as earth, right? And I think that it is important to think about the conditions of possibility for what would it mean to design political, organizational forms and imaginations to think about nationalization in the context of a planetary emergency. And if you can move, please, to this final image. I We have been mapping with a group of colleagues and friends in the project Modernismo Latinoamericano. If you could, one click, please. Um, so I invite you all to see the project of Modernismo Latinoamericano, that it opens the archive of these kinds of struggles for sovereign control over natural resources. You can see a poster of the nationalization of copper, Chile, of global intercourse on the basis not of profit, but of true solidarity within nations. And for this reason, we need to go back to the archive of Latin American popular modernism so that we can refresh and rethink our political imaginations. Thank you very much.
I think I'm next. My slides are coming up. I just want to thank Macarena for inviting, and I want to thank everyone present here, and both for the production and for the attention. My keyword, we were asked to give keywords as we were organizing, is MIM prime, money, information, more money. It means, in brief, that the general formula for capital has evolved. Capital has entered a new period in which the commodity form now appears as an instance of information, an informed object in the financialized data networks of racial capitalism. The production of information to generate more information, and thus more money, is paramount. Furthermore, it is becoming clear that genocide has become among the most cost-effective, which is to say, most profitable ways to pulverize the status quo, generate volatility, and thereby manufacture information. War criminal and sociopath Netanyahu is crystal clear that along with lavender, gospel, and daddy's home, the AI machines used to target people in Gaza, Twitter is an instrument of war. Genocide and its legitimation commands broad spectrum informatics. Next slide, please. These two images of Gaza are rendered by AI. Next slide also. Whether we consider images or the built environment, their expression and ontologies are being radically and rapidly transformed as they become computational renders. Transformed by the medium of AI. Images, landscapes, and much more are materially encoded by AI, altered according to its protocols as well as its economic exigencies. Yes, AI is a medium. Indeed, as a medium, it is an example of what I have been calling economic media. Like other media, it is expressive, but as the most attractive investment on the planet, AI leaves little room for doubt regarding capital's view on its prospective returns. Next slide. With AI, McLuhan observed in the medium is the message, namely that the content of any medium is always another medium. That idea perhaps was never more true. AI devours the archive, another step of media convergence, that is, of the devouring convergence of all prior media into calculation. This particular convergence, it has been keenly observed, including by those on this panel, places vast demands on planetary ecology. For AI is not a single thing, it is both part of media ecology and general ecology. It is an abbreviation for a semiotic, economic, cognitive, ecological, and computational agenda that would reconfigure global energy production and distribution, nation states and governance, water and land usage, the psyche, intelligence, the planetary mind, and above all, capital's exposure to the extraction of surplus value as it battles the falling rate of profit by endeavoring to drive the value of living labor and life to near zero. Next slide, please. Let's say that AI is the culminating moment in the history of economic media to date. What then is economic media? Economic media are media that have both a semiotic component and a financial component. They organize meaning and economy, use value and exchange value. Where with the Gutenberg press, painting, printing, and photography, it may have once sounded out of place to insist upon attention to the economic logic underpinning a novel or a picture. With cinema, television, and computing, the econometrics begin to exercise ever greater powers of overdetermination with respect to the content, as well with regard to the social effects of the so-called content, effects that it sets out to capture in, as I wrote long ago, attention economy. I'm now thinking particularly of social media and AI. As computing swallowed prior media and, with the rise of the web and especially with the rise of social media, re-platformed prior media on binary, it has become clear that not only are all messages subject to both semiotic protocols and economic protocols, but that such double registration is the condition of nearly all meaning making. Global digital media forms are always in the circuit to a greater or lesser degree, from mining to the production of iPhones to everything else. I'm not quite ready for that slide. So one major problem for nearly all bodies politic is that we know how to work the semiotic layer of our media. We don't know how to work the semiotic layer of media. I'm sorry, we know how to work the semiotic layer of our media. We can say or image or imagine whatever we think we want, but we don't know how to work the economic layer. We have little awareness and even less control over the value creation and distribution consequent from our communications, including little control of the economic protocols pertaining to our cognitive and kinesthetic meaning making, our thoughts, movement, and work. So our communicative media have a semiotic layer and an economic layer. They transmit and archive messages as they aggregate value for the lords of racial capitalism. This description of the dominant dispensation of planetary mediation is what I call computational racial capitalism. If such seems incontrovertible, that's because it is the dominant business model. Extract information with no remuneration or with small remuneration paid in platform currencies, company scripts to optimize your network in the network of networks. What are the implications of such a virtual machine, of a world computer? I only have time to mention a few. The subsumption of prior media by computation implies a subsumption of global semiosis by information. Information, it must be emphasized, is not a transhistorical category, but a product of a dialectics of extraction, enabling, in a word, the conversion of qualities into quantities, of concrete elements into number. The global production of the world as informatic renders its bits, all of them, subject to global calculus, that of computational racial capitalism. Even if to preserve the virtue of science, one wanted to think that the rise of information and the datification of the cosmos were separate from the history of racial capitalism, I do not. Such a one cannot fail to recognize that the recording, processing, and archiving of information is a capital investment made in anticipation of returns, that is, of interest. All that data is fixed capital, and all interests therein are or would be converted into bank interest. As soon as we understand information as method, a method of converting any interest whatever into interest on capital, and as requiring a material substrate, we may clearly apprehend the platforming of information as expressions of fixed capital. We also see that the massive investment in AI indicates capital's perception of a way to combat the falling rate of profit and move expeditiously from M to M prime, from money to more money. Datification, the conversion of any quality whatever into quantities, indicates that the movement from M to M prime expressed here in what Marx called capital's concise style, is mediated by information, thus MIM prime. Here, ghost work, screens, the strip mining of attention and libido, not to mention strip mining, carceral time, becoming a target, all come to mind. Workers, or whom I now think of as informatic laborers, who are sources of living information, create state changes in discrete state machines instead of simply informing matter, as was the case with simple commodity production. Next slide, please. Though abstract, neither these changes nor the consequences remain abstract. Put another way, the abstraction process is material, lived, and also kills. Indicated by the shift are tremendous transformations in the forms of labor, rules of law, commodity objects, money and currencies, terms of survival, assets, risk management tools, social differences, network derivatives, options, futures, and the very space and practice of politics. The dissolution of ontological guarantees, the compounding of the discriminatory social differences cultivated and institutionalized over time by racial capitalism, the institutionalization of genocide, along with carcerality, policing, and the racism, gender essentialism, and rampant psychosis that accompanies these strategies, suddenly appear as among the most profitable ways of producing information. As Helga Tawil-Suri writes a couple of days ago in an article called Bitification and the Gaza Genocide, quote, Palestinians and Palestine are continuously disassembled, reassembled, and processed into digital data, whether for the purposes of killing or media consumption. Stop the genocides, free Palestine. Thank you.
I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you so much to Martha and Evan and all the organizers. I hope the sound is okay. Let me know if there are any sound problems. Oh, not here. Where? Okay, just a moment. Okay, I'm going to share some poems with you from the probability engine. We watched it on our phones as the ice in Antarctica melted, broke off, floated away in bergs larger than Manhattan, sheets of ice miles wide tearing like skin, glaciers pouring in on themselves as they became rivers to the sea. The last piece of Antarctic ice melting into an ocean of grease. We saw it with our eyes. We went to Antarctica. We gathered the data for years. We wrote reports and it wasn't enough. We organized together as scientists. We glued ourselves to the doors of the banks. We cried over the numbers, telling us what was coming. We did everything we could. Isaac, can you show a slide? Thank you. Yes. This is the last piece of Antarctic ice. We watched it on our phones. You kissed the lifeless eyes of the soul of his soul. Just a little girl with her hair in two poofs, killed by bombs dropped on Gaza. A man holding up the remaining pieces of his child in bags. Rows of bodies wrapped in white names and marker. A mass grave. A devastating poem in Arabic. Tens of thousands of tons of bombs supplied by the U.S. dropped from Israeli jets, burning the last of the carbon we could afford, feeding the world with ethnic cleansing. We saw it on our phones and talked to our collectives and families, or started new collectives. We flooded the streets to say no to genocide. We blocked intersections, banks, bridges. We stopped our cars on the Golden Gate and threw our keys into the bay, chanting ceasefire now, end the occupation. We saw through our phones people we loved suffering incomprehensible loss. We saw humans like us reporting daily on the attacks on their homes, families, and neighbors. We saw this could not go on. We watched it on our phones as the global meetings run by oil executives gavelled their consensus without the small island nations even being in the room, as their statements protected the fossil lobbies and condemned everyone else. We went to the global meetings, to the COP, the G8, the G20. We protested when they said we weren't allowed to. We interrupted their statements. We cried at their inaction. We made plans together to protect the most vulnerable until it was at our doors. The guns, the tanks, the fires, the floods, and as the land shrank and the smoke-filled sky fell down on our heads, we finally started to talk to each other about how to stop the ones with power from destroying us all. Until we stop the destruction and the killing, we will never forget. We will rebuild farther from the shores. We will teach our children to always give more value to life than to money, to always see that the other is a person too. Okay, if the sound is okay, I will go ahead. I will read one more.
Yes, but please lean in. It helps so much. The further you lean in, the better. Thank you. Beautiful.
Okay, great. Isaac, can you go ahead 2 slides? Thank you. And this is a poem of I mean, this is a 17-foot sculpture of the Atlantic meridian overturning circulation, the tipping point that is the Atlantic Ocean current that's in the verge of dispersing or reversing. Um, and the poem is, "We will be the tipping point. We will be the tipping point from a world where only a few matter, only a few are cared for, from a world where children in Gaza are bombed in schools and hospitals. Ocean will show us the way. A global current made up of local eddies, whirling, dancing, self-organizing, is being pushed down by melting Arctic ice, is overturning. And we must overturn as well. To a world where those who are in the most need will receive the most care because we take care of us. And in solidarity, we care for others. To a world where every child has a quiet, soft place to grow and learn and love. We will be the tipping point. We must overturn. I think that's probably my time. God, I guess. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks to all the folks who've spoken already, and thanks to the organizers. I am going to be sharing my contributions to this panel, to this conversation, and doing so on behalf of my colleague Inge Salo, who is regrettably not able to join. Inge is in South Africa where she lives, and between the time change or the time difference and a bunch of other complications, Inge is not able to join. Our thoughts as part of this conversation are informed by a paper we co-wrote a few years ago. And from that, we are interested in articulating a sort of a framework of Black environmental humanities anchored in an idea of insurgent eco-criticism. And so we're interested in thinking about what such an insurgent eco-critical perspective on extractivism and mining can offer us. In the article, we ask a number of questions, or we pose the article as a response to a number of questions. The first of which is, what is the character of Black spatial and environmental critique? How does Black eco-criticism challenge existing human environmental thinking and constructs? What becomes knowable about symbolic and physical geographical and ecological space, Blackness, and race when we take poetics seriously? And the final question we ask is, how can methodologies attentive to Black cultures of fugitivity, improvisation, struggle, and placemaking allow for the disclosure of new insights about Black movements, Black mobility, Black geographical and ecological histories? And we think these questions have some pertinence to thinking through the cascading crises that are as a result of the logics of extractivism and how that logic is articulated through mining and the disruption of communities. And so we are informed or try to advance connections between Black geographies and Black ecologies, which are two distinct modes of study, but have a shared interest in what we read as an insurgent eco-criticism, which is to say a mode of critique and analysis that unsettles the lack of attention to race in the reproduction of literary ecologies, and eco-criticism that does not consider Black environmental literature, discourses, and epistemologies worthy of incorporating into critiques. And so Black geographies and ecologies, we argue, constitute a long tradition of Black resistance and counter-hegemonic thought that is often understood as being the Black radical tradition. And so we see Black geographies and ecologies as offering usable models for human environmental thinking and human environmental relationships that are based on world making. And one of the things we like about Black geographers and ecologists is that the interest in world making is not just literary, which is what happens sometimes with eco criticism, but with also the sort of materiality of the production of space. And if we take the questions of materiality seriously, we argue that the kinds of logics of radical anti-racist world making that are necessary have to be insurgent because they're straining against the sort of established orders. And so part of what we wanted to do with this paper, and which kind of makes sense in a minute for what we want to do with our intervention in this panel, is to suggest that Black epistemologies, Black agency, Black spatial poetics, which include stories, recipes, food practices, musical traditions, poetry, and everyday grounded theories, that those together coherently offer a framework for not just analyzing, critiquing, and sort of identifying the necropolitical logics of ecocidal violence and the other haunting afterlives of modernity's sins, but also offer us this sort of capacious mode of pursuing abolitionist geographies. And so we want to think about these questions of extractivism, mining, the sort of damned afterlives and current instantiations of fossil capitalism, right? I want to think about those things without over-determining people's lives by them, right? And so without making people, sort of subjected to the unbearable weight of narratives of destruction, damnation, deficit, and environmental injustice, right? Instead, to clarify the multiplicity of radical and insurgent geographies and ecologies that evince this capacious repertoire for how we might actually start to build futures that are more desirable. Right. And so I think our interest is in advancing a mode of critique, scholarship, activism that both mourns ecocidal and racial violence, but memorializes these archives of world making, of freedom dreams, of kinship making, of ecological stewardship. Now, why is that important? It's important because our current conjuncture is, characterized by the intensification of fossiliferous capitalism and varied forms of rare earth mineral resource extractivism, and as we know, couched under the aegis or the rubric of national security and maybe even civilizational security, right? And even as the precarity of that political economy, fossil political economy is laid bare, we still see the sort of investments in it. Right. And this kind of death drive, we think, is problematic. What we also notice, and I think others have hinted at this and spoken to this directly, is that increasingly there's an externalization of the cost of what we call techno-bro-futurism and AI boosterism, which are water intensive, energy intensive, and these costs are being externalized into marginalized communities who are already disproportionately affected by all manners of other environmental injustices and forms of racial and social exploitation. And so why is this particularly disturbing in the present conjuncture? I think we also see the alignment of the kind of techno innovation mining oligarchs, what some folks have called the Silicon Valley overlords. We see an alignment between those particular folks and right-wing and authoritarian political coalitions interested in, invested in, and actively weakening the regulatory apparatuses of the state. And so in that present conjuncture, and we have images of the headlines, we can populate a composite image of all of the headlines, right? With these stories of communities being targeted. I think I have a slide with some of those images, right? So we've got these images, right? And we can find them anywhere. We can, populate them using any number of stories. Just today, the next slide shows that just today in Argentina, we see a ruling that advances the assault on environmental activists by rolling back protections. What we want to do with the type of work we're advancing is to make connections between that and what we have seen and are seeing in places like Atlanta with the Cop City project and with the responses to it. We know that, for example, this connection allows us to bring to the fore the ways in which environmental defense and land defense has always been violent, even if not always visible for us here in the United States, but in Guatemala, in Honduras, all across Central and South America, there are these stories that help us to recognize that these are deadly serious questions. We know that the question of extractivism is also a question of settler colonial logics that are being articulated, laid bare, right? The naked wrath of capitalism's investment in destruction is something that we can see today also in Palestine, right? And so we are interested in advancing a type of critique that brings those two things together. Now, if Inge were here, she would share a little bit about what is happening in South Africa, which is also providing ways to notice how these sort of Promethean investments in the future and in a just transition are reliant upon the entrenchment of forms of extractivism in these invisibilized places. And so to kind of wrap up, I've got 2 slides left. One is one of the authors or a set of authors that anchor or critique, and that's this quote by Clyde Woods and Catherine McKittrick in their defining book. And we can return to this. But basically, the idea here is that we take seriously that physical geographies are not simply the background of human events, right? That the kinds of ecological violence and racial violence that assault life everywhere on the planet right now are conjoined, right? So the co-constitution of what Malcolm Ferdinand in a different context calls a double fracture of modernity, right, is what we insist that has to be analyzed together. And then finally, I'll end with this quote by Sylvia Wynter, who advances a similar kind of critique, right? And what I think both of these two sets of work do in relation to the paper we've written is to suggest that what we need are nuanced clarifications of how this contemporary conjuncture recuperates, right, these logics of the plantation and the reservation, right, which are the new ghosts and old ghosts of modernity's original sins. We need morally sharp articulations of why environmental justice is not simply a question of law enforcement or policy adherence, but a matter of the very conception of the human, right? And we need an incisive criticism that is going to be able to link the racial discourse of animality, which sneaks into environmental discourse and conservation discourse, all manners of dehumanizing logics and all kinds of colonial logics that make the sort of genocidal assaults on Palestine possible in this moment, that make some deaths in the U.S. excusable on the basis that we try to make palatable, ISIS intensified terrorism of certain groups, right? And so we need also, in the face of all of this, ambitious constructions of a more desirable future that are affirmative, rooted in a politics of care, and that learn from disabled scholars and learn from abolitionist scholars. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Macarena, and thank you to all the team for this invitation. Next. So today we're here to briefly talk to you about AI extractivism, new protocols and new publics in the context of Chile. Nicolás will start us off. Next.
On January 31, 2026, the communities of Quilicura, led by Corporación Again, carry out a performance in which residents transform themselves into a collective intelligence capable of responding to all kinds of prompts. Next, please. So from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., more than 40 people from Quilicura managed to answer more than 25,000 prompts from more than 68 countries. The aim was, in this performance, to denounce the new form of extractivism taking place in their territories. Next slide. The AI industry relies heavily on a planetary supply chain, depending on resources such as copper, gold, lithium for its GPU, oceanic cables, as well as water or energy to run data centers. Next slide, please.
This new accelerated form of extraction differs significantly from traditional practices such as mining, both in terms of processing speed and spatial presence. Whereas extraction activities were once confined to remote, largely unreachable, and therefore invisible locations. Next. The AI industry is now embedding data centers within urban environments, making these infrastructures increasingly visible and integrated into everyday life. Next.
Chile embodies an ambivalent condition within the AI supply chain. It is both a territory of raw material extraction, but also a site for deployment of digital infrastructure. This dual positioning situates the country across multiple moments of the AI supply chain, revealing how this new form of extractivism operates in the digital age within the very same territory. Next slide. In 2024, Chile updated its national AI intelligence policy. The document claims that this technology has the capacity to prevent environmental damage before it occurs. Nevertheless, the policy acknowledges the challenges of deploying this technology to reduce high energy and water consumption through data centers. Faced with this situation, the guideline assures the reader Chile is ready, depicting a frictionless scenario, dismissing the fundamental contradiction between AI extractive infrastructure and environmental harm against its promised benefits. This is regulated to the country environmental evaluation regulations. Next slide.
So while metallic mining projects such as copper mining, Chile's most well-known industry, require environmental permits that trigger strict protocols and public participation, projects like data centers are often subject to abbreviated procedures. That is the difference between an environmental impact assessment, or AIA, versus an environmental impact declaration, a DIA. The latter are streamlined regulations meant that public participation must be actively demanded by communities, which are not always aware of what's happening in their own neighborhoods. Next. Over the past decade, the installed capacity of data centers in Chile has experienced a rapid growth, with 22 in operation. All of these projects were submitted to the environmental evaluation system, stating no significant environmental impact. Each submission initiates a process in which citizens may request a formal participation stage if a sufficient number of petitions are gathered. However, this mechanism has remained largely symbolic. Out of the 24 data center assessments registered on the CEHAB platform, only 5 included any form of citizen participation. Next. I think the slide. If you can go back one, please. Oh, it's missing, but it's... So this new extractive economies, particularly the data center industry, are now so streamlined following widespread changes to permitting processes in Chile, commonly referred to as permisología, that data centers are currently exempt from mandatory environmental declarations. It is now up to a civil servant tasked with a relevance inquiry to determine whether such projects must be subjected to the public scrutiny of the environmental impact assessment system, effectively rendering data center projects invisible to academia and to communities, which previously had at least some access to project documentation. Next. In none of these instances did citizen mobilization occur driven by official citizen participation protocols. Contestation episodes in Quilicura or Cerrillos did not arise from these institutional channels. In other words, community resistance has been articulated outside official participatory spaces, revealing the limitations of an environmental evaluation process that assesses impacts only through abstract documentation while disregarding the lived realities of affected territories. Next.
While the
I think next.
Next, please.
Yes.
While there is a significant effort within academia and journalists to highlight the water footprint of data centers, these approaches have been limited to viewing the building as an abstract entity, that is, to assess the impact of data centers based on water consumption metric. This causes the conversation to revolve around the cooling system, tending towards an exchange of arguments present as technical facts. In this context, we opt to think through local communities' efforts, such as Kili AI, to establish a space of dialogue with big tech companies. Resistencia Socioambiental Quilicura and Corporación Neguén, Díaz, aims to find a broader objective, to challenge AI extractivism by sitting down to mediate the relationship between data centers and body of water, not as technical problems, but as a case of cohabitation. Next, please. As curator of the Chilean pavilion, Reflective Intelligence, with Serena Ambrosio at the recent Biennale, Architecture Biennale in Venice, we sought to articulate this desire. Its public program became a space for different stakeholders to come together in ways that have, in many cases, been unprecedented. Community organization, industry, academia, and state representatives have not traditionally sat at the same table simultaneously to share concern and to discuss the impact of the data center industry. Next slide, please. Next slide. The most recent event took place on March 16 under the title Digital Vertigo. The meeting summoned actors from the industry such as Google or Hyphen, communities organizations as Mosacat, Kili AI, Resistencia Socioambiental, and academics such as Carolina Gainza, Mónica Meres, and Sebastián Lewede. In the absence of dialogue overseen by government regulator, we have engaged in an exercise in future diplomacy to flesh out the arguments that matter when discussing these issues. What unforeseen consequence can academia help us anticipate? What concerns can community bring to our attention? What can industry better identify compensatory projects that do not create financial burdens for communities? Next, please.
To resist is a perpetual present state where no change can take place. It exhausts time, energy, and resources from community organizations that remain locked in a defensive position. To truly enact change, we must move in a transdisciplinary, coordinated effort to collectively rehearse the protocols needed to engage in new forms of diplomacy that seek not to solve problems, but engender a new public, or as environmental humanities scholar Leslie Green calls, an environmental public. A new public that re-engages with politics by participating in the delineation of the yet unknown environmental impacts, enacting somehow a political life otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It's a really deep honor to be part of this symposium. My name's Daniel Selwyn. I'm a researcher and educator of the London Mining Network. It's been a real privilege so far to be able to listen to and learn from my fellow co-panelists, and a particular thanks to Macarena and the Centre for Environmental Humanities at Brown for initiating and organizing this collaboration. And I'm really excited to see how it develops and be part of that. So the London Mining Network, we're an alliance of more than 20 organizations based in London, working to expose human rights abuses and environmental crimes that are committed by mining companies based here. And London is an epicenter of the global mining and arms industries. We campaign alongside and in solidarity with affected communities for social justice, indigenous sovereignty, and the ecological integrity of the planet. I'm also a geography teacher, a trade unionist, and a Jewish anti-Zionist organizer. And these are all presences that I'm going to bring to this presentation. And the presentation is going to center around two main scenes and how, by understanding them together and resisting accordingly, we can build the movements of sufficient counterweight to reach the tipping point, as Misha's moving poems alerted us, that are capable of dismantling the infrastructures of genocide and ecocide and overthrowing their architects. First slide, please. And the image. So the image that you can see is an AI-generated one of a place, or an imagined place, called Fort Foundry 1. and this is a proposed new industrial park and tech center in the Nakab Desert, a landscape inhabited by indigenous Palestinian Bedouin communities for generations, despite the settler imaginaries of an empty land that's now being projected into the future. Bedouin Palestinians have faced decades of systemic land confiscation and forced displacement and are now targeted by increased settler violence and economic exploitation. And where this fantasized tech center sits in the broader geographies of settler colonial expansion, imperialist warfare, resource extraction, and digital infrastructures is the first scene. But first, we're going to need to zoom out a little bit. To reiterate what Macarena said at the beginning, both of the scenes that I'm sharing are set in a conjuncture of intensifying war, rising authoritarianism, and climate emergencies. And to add Alex's important corrective, this conjuncture remains rooted in the colonial plantation and reservation, even as it expresses itself across new extractive zones. At LMN, we see these as fundamentally entangled processes, not only due to the extraordinary wastage of financial resources into military supply chains, rather than democratically organized renewable energy systems that are necessary to avert the irreversible climate feedback loops that could force billions of people to migrate or die on a planet whose habitability, in Martin's framing, is becoming increasingly hostile. But the climate catastrophes of militarism are also inscribed in the extractive zones that mine rare earth deposits for drones, uranium for nuclear weapons, silicon, cobalt, and copper for AI semiconductors, lithium and graphite for data storage. When we add the carbon emissions of military operations, as well as the destruction of habitats and civilian infrastructures, which are now, at least in my memory, indelibly imprinted by the scenes of oil raining down from the skies over Tehran, it is beyond reasonable doubt, in my opinion, that the military is indeed Earth's greatest enemy, as Abby Martin's new documentary calls it. Given this dialectical movement between conflict and climate change, I think it's significant to note the Pentagon's $1.6 billion investment in critical mineral firms like USA Rare Earth and MP Materials, despite it being a mere drop in the $1.5 trillion ocean of military spending. As are the US mineral and security partnership agreements with the Congo and Ukraine, the plans to annex Greenland, which has one of the world's largest rare earth deposits, and the threats to withhold HIV/AIDS treatments to Zambia in order to force the government into signing a deal to give the US more access to its critical minerals. While these could all appear as isolated incidents, together they express the centrality of resource extraction to the war crimes of our present, as well as militarized ambitions for imperialist futures. At this stage, I think it's worth noting that our current conjuncture is also contoured by China's relative dominance of the extraction and production sectors that make military industrial supply chains possible. And of course, as John's presentation outlined, AI technologies are now fully integrated into these war plans and kill chains, confirmed by the application of AI systems like Anthropic's Claude in the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, as well as in the target selection of a girls' school in Minab, where a double-tap missile strike killed at least 175 primary school children, or in the Israeli occupation forces' use of lavender, gospel, and Where's Daddy to create kill lists and locate targets during the carpet bombing of Gaza, which, far from ceasing, continues to expand regionally into Lebanon, where the Zionist entity carried out 100 airstrikes yesterday in 10 minutes, another live-streamed massacre. In this context, the US Department of State's flagship strategy on AI infrastructures and so-called supply chain security, the PAX Silica, announced at the end of 2025, I believe demands our critical attention and engagement. While PAX comes from the Latin term for peace and denotes stability, albeit under an imperial hegemon, the PAX Silica heralds an increased militarization under the banner of a particular resource. Israel was the first country to sign the Pax Silica, but it's been joined by 12 more, including Qatar, the UAE, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and my own country, the UK. The Pax Silica intends to partner across global technology supply chains, including in mineral refining and processing and energy extraction. And it discloses explicitly that major mining companies like Anglo-Australian company Rio Tinto are already being integrated into that ecosystem. It also includes strategic partnerships like Orion Critical Mineral Consortium between the US government, Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, and a London-based private equity firm that are intending to invest in mining and refining projects globally, as well as a huge rare earth processing facility being built in Saudi Arabia by the Pentagon alongside US mining company MP Materials and Saudi mining company Ma'aden. Israel's agreement with the US in January included a commitment to build a nuclear-powered industrial park to produce advanced computer chips and data centers in the Negev Desert, which is the AI envisioned for Foundry 1 that you can see on your screens. The so-called Digital Negev already hosts an Israeli occupation force data center known as David Citadel since 2020, which occupies over 20,000 square meters of Bedouin Palestinian land, housing more than 100 steel and aluminium server racks, hosting over 300 IOF systems on computer semiconductors, silicon memory chips. So while the fantasized Fort Foundry 1 so far only exists in AI-generated imagery, the colonial aspiration for further settlement on the broken villages of the Palestinian people can and must be resisted. I've been told to come to time now, and I'm happy to finish there, or I can move on to the second scene, which is the Pax Silica from below, and talk a bit more about the resistance to it. Up to you, Matt.
Yeah, I think that is wonderful, and you really made a lot of the points in a short amount of time. So I'd like to welcome everyone back onto the screen, into the general forum, and thank you so much, Daniel, for that wonderful presentation. Everyone did exactly as we had asked, these instructions to get a lot of material, conceptualization, language in relationship to new extractivisms. And Martín starting us off, considering the question of nationalization, habitability, and really considering the way in which the kind of majority of the world, right, the global working class needs to take back sovereign control over resources and over capital. I really appreciated that tierra that you brought up, the language in Spanish is land and planet simultaneously, and then you concluding, Martín, with that kind of sense of the Latin American popular modernity as part of the answer. Maybe translation is also part of the answer. We've long been doing that work, right, as Alex also pointed out and others pointed out, of bringing forward like answers from the global South and indigenous spaces, Black insurgent spaces, etc. John, this kind of ongoing work, I hope you'll come and join us at Brown and continue the conversation. What a compact presentation of a lifetime of work on the computational. You gave us so much to think about how the machine devours the archive, how to consider planetary media ecologies as semiotic and financial in ways that absolutely exhaust life, the kind of recording and processing and archive of information. And really this idea that maybe we could tease out a little more if we had more time of strip mining of the libido in social media, but also strip mining of the land. I think that's a really important formulation and gets us in to be able to think with queer and trans studies, queer and trans astric elemental studies, approaches that bring that dimension as well. And Misha in the kind of performance and poetics is also really thinking from that place of what is capable of stopping the destruction, she asks, as you pointed out as well, Daniel. And, you know, maybe language itself needs to be reconsidered. Poetics, shifting the terms of what Vandana Shiva calls the monoculture of the mind, right? Alex and Inge, this critical work that you're doing, thank you for compressing it. I want to draw people's attention to the article. Maybe we can drop that in the chat about kind of Black insurgent eco-critical modes, fugitive methodologies. You gave us so much to think with there. And not only thinking from the space of kind of mourning and what's dead, but these kind of life forms that are always about pushing back against that kind of aggregate value of racial capitalism. That was really an important set of interventions. Black spatial poetics, spatial agencies, and then to end with kind of the grounded work of Linda and Daniel. I just so appreciate this work that I know will take many more forms because it's early in terms of what's happening in data centers, but you've done that research. You've talked about the accelerated forms, the way AI is moving, and then you gave us this kind of sense of the potentialities of opening up a kind of public environmental space, which I have to admit, I have my own doubts about that. And I don't know if I'm becoming more cynical, the world is becoming more cynical, or both at the same time. But I think that, I really appreciate these openings that you all are offering us in this moment. So any reactions initially to each other? I also see that we have some Q&A. So if any of the participants want to jump in, I'll count to 5. Otherwise, I'm going to move now to the Q&A. Okay, so thank you again. That was a lot to metabolize, but that was the point, putting out propositions. Anna asks from the audience, thank you everyone for sharing. For Alex, could say a little bit more how you integrate global Indigenous and Black traditions into insurgent eco-criticism, and then more broadly for everyone, how you maintain your personal energy for the fight in the midst of ongoing atrocity. Thank you, Anna. That's really important. And then an anonymous question, if the panelists can address the question of intelligibility or unintelligibility in terms of thwarting extraction. What do we do as critical thinkers to avoid capture by these corrupt and inept information systems? And then the last one that I'll put on the table by Shifa just coming in, Shifa Patel, thank you, is digital extraction, creating new forms of colonialism between developing and developing countries. We'll come back to Chenren's question if we can do another round to kind of close us out. But if any of the panelists, starting with you, Alex, can address some of those questions.
It's a lovely question. I wanted to say something about this question of the machine eating up the archive, right? And the sort of material politics of energy consumption and how that is disruptive of particular types of archives that are in places that are under-resourced. And so I think there's something to be said about the forms of erasure that accompany that in a kind of material way. But to the question, I think we are, Inge and I are both geographers, and we identify as Black geographers, which is a particular type of framework. And we're also drawing on Black ecologies, which sort of emerged out of Black studies. But one of the things we like about these two related fields within Black studies is that following the work of amazing feminist thinkers like Tiffany Lethabo King, thinking about the ways in which the sort of colonial constitution of identity and subjectivity creates these borders, these borders of embodiment that structure indigeneity and Blackness as incommensurable and mutually exclusive, right? And so part of what we do in or work together and respectively is to try to push back against that. And so one of the ways to think about this is the ways in which these types of subjectivities are a consequence of the kind of conquistador humanism, right? That is the sort of colonial logics that comes to define different types of humans in certain kinds of ways, and then purports to tell us that Black people need to do this, Indigenous people need to do that. And so part of what we want to do is to insist on those connections and the relationalities without subsuming the sort of material trajectories that those different forms of embodiment have been subjected to, right? And so thinking coalitionally about the sort of shared projects in realizing ways that we can be human without being human at the expense of the other, or ways of being human that are not predicated upon othering as a particular project of subjectification. And so it is work that requires thinking with Indigenous folks. It is work that also recognizes Black indigeneity. It is work that recognizes that sometimes the particular ways in which struggle is articulated might mean that we are, as one geographer, Juanita Sundberg, suggests walking together without necessarily pursuing exactly the same type of political project. And the last thing I'll say about this is that, capitalism has had and colonialism have had a couple hundred years to figure out these structures of difference. And there is sometimes, I think, a kind of disempowering question. Well, can you fix all of this with this particular thing? Well, part of what we want to suggest in the article is that probably we can't, but by improvising and composing new ways of being in relation in like actually materially concrete ways that we see all over the world, that we can begin to tease out, and maybe it's going to proceed in fits and starts, these different trajectories. We're informed by the work of folks in the Caribbean and in Latin America and in Southern Africa, where Inge is based, that are building communities on small scale and even at national scale across, international boundaries to kind of make life together in ways that refuse capitalism and sort of colonial politics of subjectification.
Thank you, Alex. That's really great. I'm going to go to Misha and then Daniel, but I don't want to lose these questions to John and Martin that I think have some interrelation and also offer Linda and Nicolás some space to close us out. So go ahead, Misha.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope I can be heard. I wanted to answer the question about intelligibility. I think that we have such a clear example in the current regime in the US that is, in Musk, that is in Elon Musk, that is eco-fascist, but also this confluence of, anti-trans fascism with extractivism in terms of wanting to take Greenland. And I think that especially also thinking about fugitive methods, I'm just thinking so much about trans studies and trans people in the US. I am actually currently on the way to Canada with my daughter because of the situation here. I don't know if many folks heard that the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention in the end of March released their third red flag alert for anti-trans genocide in the United States. And on unintelligibility, right? Of course, the first day, the president said only men and women exist in the United States. We don't acknowledge anyone else exists, which is a plainly genocidal statement that they have continued to try to make into a reality. And its most latest incarnation is that ICE is authorized now to check people's papers if they think that their gender might not, their gender on their documents might not match their birth gender. Yeah, I'm just seeing this confluence of all these issues. Thanks so much, everyone.
Misha, thank you for bringing that up. And that's, in other phases of extractivism, it is indeed, this kind of widening network of criminalizing more and more people, and certainly people in the binary, as you bring up. And John, I want to come back to you in a minute about that kind of that binary question that we can't seem to escape because of the computational logics. But Daniel, I'll give you the next word, and let's just everyone be conscious of time and then move to Martin and John before ending again with Linda.
I was going to respond briefly to the question around maintaining personal energy in the midst of all of this atrocity, and weave into that answer some of the things that I was going to mention in the second half of my presentation. Is that for me, being part of the London Mining Network, being in movement with others gives me a source of energy. The steadfastness, the resilience of the Palestinian people in resistance gives us energy. The communities on the front lines of extractivism and militarism facing intense repression and violence give us energy here, at least for me in London, in the Imperial Core, to continue resisting, and we have no other choice but to do so. So I wanted to just quickly spotlight two global coalitions against two mining companies. So Resistencia Activa Ya, which is a global coalition uniting communities that are affected by Glencore, and the No to Anglo movement, which is uniting communities affected by Anglo-American. And we have the opportunity at LMN, when we bring communities from these disparate geographies where these mining giants are devastating the ecologies, the livelihoods, and the health of the local communities. So, for example, Anglo American's AGM that's happening at the end of the month here in London, we're going to have representatives from South Africa and Zambia, from Chile and from Colombia, all coming together to share information, knowledge, and exchange and strategy in order to think about how we can actually fundamentally resist these mining giants that are at the base of the supply chains for AI and for military technologies as well. So I think we really need to take our leadership from those affected communities, whether that be in Palestine, whether that be in Colombia, who are resisting colonialism on the ground, and that can give us our energy to keep going.
Great. So, John and Martin, you notice that there's long questions there for you about anti-colonial struggle, about the ways of thinking, a kind of planetary challenge. I think Daniel was just addressing some of that. Alex certainly has addressed that with some depth. But if you can continue to answer that in relationship to Martin, what you proposed, and then we'll move to John as well on the question of thinking more with MIM prime and those kinds of relationships, how to conceptualize cycles. So, Martin, go ahead.
Yes, Macarena. Sorry, I think I don't recall. Was there a specific question
Yeah, I'll
directed
read it
towards
to
me,
you.
or?
I'm happy to read it to you. This is from Tianren Lu, one of our students here in the environmental humanities at Brown. Thank you, Professor Arboleda. I do appreciate your attempt to reclaim the anti-colonial tradition in Mexico, but also more generally across Africa, Latin America, and Asia to rethink nationalization as a way toward possible anti-extractive political mobilization. My question is how to conceive the reappropriation and reshaping or redesign of the pre-existing institutions and the apparatuses of the post-colonial nation state, which themselves are often extractive within this collective effort, especially given the current planetary challenges we face. And just to give a little context, Chenren is studying financialization and extractivism and their interlinkages with us. So go ahead, Martin.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a hugely relevant and I think urgent question to think about the role of the state apparatus in contemporary processes of nationalization or like collective control over natural resources. And I think an answer to this might be perhaps to like go back to the archival record and think about how state institutions were reconfigured in processes of nationalization. So, for example, me and a colleague, Pablo Vivort, are currently working on an article precisely that brings into dialogue resource nationalization and global financial power in historical comparative analysis. And we looked at, for example, the creation of transnational organizations for international solidarity, the creation of the OPEC in 1960, but also the CPEC, like the International Organization for Copper Producers, led by the government of Allende in Chile, amongst other economies. So there have been many efforts to think about radical forms of like wielding and harnessing state power to assert control over sovereign control over natural resources. And but I think like this has been a kind of eclipsed history, and I think we need to kind of look and return to this like global history of nationalization precisely to like open up the institutional imagination. Of course, like the rise of a sinocentric network of global financial institutions, the Asia Infrastructure Bank, the BRICS Bank, are all like in certain ways opening new avenues for thinking about international solidarity, incomplete but nonetheless beyond Western hegemony and power. So again, I think history is our best ally here.
Thank you, Martin. John?
Yeah, okay, I'll jump in a little bit. I mean, I think I'll go back to this question of intelligibility for a minute and then try to broaden it. But I also just wanted to acknowledge the brilliant contributions of all the panelists and Macarena also, what you said, and the organizers. It's just really great to be here and listen to you all. On intelligibility, I mean, I guess the issue for me is that as all that is solid melts into information, That also means that things are legible by capitalism and capitalist exploitation and extraction in an n-dimensional way, right? I mean, even though binary code is sort of the basis of processing, the n-dimensionality of AI and machine learning means that pattern recognition can ascribe meaning and significance in ways that sort of exceed human capacities of discernment, including in recent work in visual racisms, right? Where phenotypical, identifiable racism is not the only way that machines operate in racist modes at this point. So the complexity of intelligibility is something that's one has to be really, really aware of and guard against. So the questions of fugitivity and the questions of capacity, these are also key questions, which to me no longer sort of exist in a static form, but have to sort of be thought of as flows and in movements and in networks. It's necessary to begin to establish alternative networks, which are in one way or another resistant to capitalization. That means not only organization and solidarity and affect, but it may mean technical arrangements, which are doing technicity otherwise. I think there's a kind of a missing piece in a lot of political struggle right now, which is precisely the technicity and the technical substrate which we use to organize. In the situation of rewrite ontologies, the capacity for machinic representations to target and destroy us is always there, and to find spaces of repose, equanimity, thriving, possibility, also means to not be subject in the same way, to not be identified or identifiable in the same way. It means actually a transsubjective embodied experience, which is not consonant with the way in which capital produces its individuals and its objects. So there's I mean, I want to just say one more thing about this, then I'll stop. But there's a question of temporality also around intelligibility and non-intelligibility. I mean, it's a way of wagering on futures, because capital seems to me is now superpositioning many futures informatically in the next term kind of prediction models of AI. And what we're forced to bet on those, we're sort of forced to wager on one future or another. And one of the ways that fascism works is it offers a wager for certain people on a spread of possibilities which they think are going to get a payoff, whether that's psychic, national, financial, or all three. And we need to be able to posit other futures. I heard a talk by Nasser Abrami yesterday, the Center for Palestine Studies, 2 days ago at Columbia, where he talked about in the camps in the 80s and 90s up until now, the IDF people were often terrified because people in the camps talk about occupation as temporary, that there is another future out there, that the occupation is not for them a permanent situation. It is something that is temporary. People in the camps will rename the streets, village names. So there's alternate times imminent in the present time, and harnessing those and creating those imaginaries and creating those sustainable economies around those imaginaries seems like a central political act for our moment.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to pass it to Nicolás and Linda on the questions of directly involved community and, just the need for activisms and public awareness. I think it continues on from where John left off, where Daniel was speaking about, where Alex, this is a good way maybe to close out the panel. So thank you for speaking to us again from your grounded research of data centers.
Thank you, Macarena. And along with Serena, this research has taken us not only to engage with communities, but also through the state, with the state institutions that assemble somehow protocols that we see are missing key parts during conversation. So Nicolás has flagged the national policy for data did not involve all actors.
Linda, I'm sorry, you're glitching out a little bit. I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah, but it's intermittent.
Can you guys hear me there? Go.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Better. Okay. So it's when I made the comment with the criticism that resistance, it's a locked-in position that ends up exhausting communities, is because we see the value in sitting down with different stakeholders at the same time in the space. Right? and Nicolás, coming from architecture, value so much the idea of having everyone at the same table, which is kind of the premise of the Chilean pavilion. I borrow from the term called the environmental public, but other authors have identified environment constituencies or environmental subjects. We see the necessity of identifying community resistance as individuals that are opposing a project, but individuals are also trying to delineate this to known environmental impact of the spaces for congregating industry, state representatives, and community members. It's extremely important to us. Nicolás can speak a bit more about it because he's worked with the communities more closely.
And we've been working with community for more than 3 years, 4 years now. So basically we start to understand, and I think Latour and Isabel Stenger has this idea of matter of fact and matter of concern. So we initially started with this idea of matter of fact that data centers consume water, but we started to engage more with community. What is their concern? And I think Martín said this idea of cohabitation of to habitate the planet. And for Quilicura community is how this infrastructure will cohabitate with the bodies of water that are being affected. So this is the matter of concern for the communities. So instead of resisting, because the data center is already built, how can we as architects design a space or a table that can help to manifest this concern about the technology, the people that are living in that comuna of Quilicura? So how can we address or try to mix all the concern about the future of to live together? So it changed the debate about. It's not about the extraction of water, but how this extraction is affecting the future of these communities.
Wonderful. And with that, we're at time. Thank you, everyone. We know we really had to compress everything. Daniel, thank you for co-hosting. We continue to think with you and all the wonderful references that you put in the chat and the work of the London Mining Network that's ongoing. Fatina, I'm sorry we weren't able to answer your important question about eco-narratological perspectives, but I put it in the chat to make sure that it's on the top of mind of, maybe to bring it up again tomorrow as we continue. So again, I just want to thank you for these incredible presentations, your ongoing work. Tomorrow we continue. Most of it is hybrid. We open with Shiban Angus and Mingwei Huang in a panel moderated by Ada Tarek on questions of materiality and environments of dispossession that continues from today. We move to an activation by the artist Teresa Borracino, and we see a film and we hear from anti-extractive activists Yolanda Quispe and Vito Calderon, who live right alongside the glacier in Peru. And so we're going to continue to experiment with Zoom. And then we end with a wonderful apex moment, thinking with Vanessa Agard-Jones. Many of us have read the work on beaches and the Caribbean in a keynote presentation called Ground Wars with an introduction by our own postdoc, Sherrod Johnson. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, everyone. We know it was compressed, but we look forward to continuing the dialogue tomorrow. And have a great evening, a good morning, or a good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Thank you, Macarena.